And here are the words to Radio Gaga. What a great song about why radio is so wonderful, especially for people who grew up listening to them, to transistor radios for their music. So a little introduction to radio there. And so here's an agenda for what we're going to cover. So what is radio? How and why did it develop? Then I'm going to take you through we said that radio was the first electronic medium. There actually is one before that called the telegraph. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about the beginnings of broadcasting in the U.S., of radio being used as a commercial business venture to carry advertising. And we're going to talk about radio content, listen to some examples. We'll talk about how radio eventually was replaced by television in the home as the center for family entertainment, but radio, unlike television, could be listened to in the car, so it kind of made a move to be on the go in the car and transistor radios. We're going to talk about also some of the challenges of the radio impression, which of course is only sound. And when I say only sound, you can actually do a lot with sound if you're creative and use it to engage the imagination, much as the words in a magazine ad or a book can engage our imagination, as we discussed in the last class. And radio is often referred to as theater of the mind. And I'm going to give you an extreme and kind of funny example of that. Then we'll talk about buying radio, day parts and ratings, and local markets. And then we'll look at the industry itself and how it's changing and who are some of the key players and what are the trends today. So it's a lot to cover. Radio, and there it is. There is a group of adults in the 1930s listening to a big piece of furniture, the radio, probably in the living room of a home. And this is what people did in those days, because when it was commercialized and the networks were formed, they developed all kinds of very entertaining programming, from music and dance orchestras playing to situation comedies, much like our situation comedies today, variety shows, dramas, mysteries, and it was a lot of fun for people to listen to the radio and listen to those words and sounds and kind of create their own theater of the mind. Radio also used, of course, very effectively for not just entertainment, but for information, for transmitting news, as in World War II, Edward R. Murrow broadcasting from London, and also for information like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chats, which were done on the radio. He was a master of using the radio. And unfortunately, so were our adversaries in World War II. The Germans and the Nazis were also very effective users of this mass medium to communicate and to sway opinions in a very, very bad way. What is the definition of radio? Well, here are several. Transmission and reception of electromagnetic waves of radio frequency, especially those carrying sound messages. The activity or industry of broadcasting sound programs to the public, and that's pretty much what we're talking about here. And that's why, by the way, a podcast is classified as radio. Radio is also a noun. It's the machine, the apparatus that receives the signal and can turn it back into sound. So there are some definitions for radio. We usually like to start with definitions of things, and then just take a few steps back in terms of what are some of the problems in a way, or what did radio help us solve. And radio and telegraph before that, and we're going to talk about telegraph in a second, in essence became very fast long-distance communication. And I'll just ask you to think back to when we talked about the early newspapers a couple of classes ago, how the early colonial American newspapers had to wait for ships from Europe and from England to get the news from England and the continent. And so it was often several months late because it took that long to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And, there was no immediate communication long distance between Europe and the Americas. In fact, you'll remember that a number of the local papers in New York banded together to pay for someone in a boat to sail out to the ships from Europe and get the news on behalf of all the newspapers so they could all get it at once. Radio and telegraph before that changed all that. The telegraph used wires. It was not a wireless broadcasting technology, as was radio. But what did people do to send messages over long distances? Well, have you ever heard of semaphore? Okay, so this is a visual way of communicating some very basic sentences and things. Ships at sea would use different signals, flags that would stand for different messages and letters. And it's just kind of the same thing with semaphore. And then I have a little video for you to watch here, so I'm going to cut, showing you some other very, very old long-distance communication you might think is kind of interesting.